time we say goodbye, my dear. I don't know why it's so unclear. Your mouth says go away.
Hello everyone and welcome to There and Then, a journey through literature from our family to yours. I'm your host Don Gutteridge. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is a podcast where we take a look at the collected works of one Canadian author, my grandpa, Don Gutteridge. We're going to learn what inspired him, what still inspires him, and have a bit of fun along the way. If you're interested in CanLit, history of Southwestern Ontario, or just want to hear a grandson and his grandfather connecting over some funny stories, you've come to the right place. First, a small biographical note. Don's the author of well over 100 books. He's written in poetry, fiction, non-fiction. He's written novels and academic works about teaching English. Today we're going to be focusing on two books of poetry that were written in the late 70s and early 80s. A True History of Lambton County and God's Geography. As tends to be the case with older works like these, both of the books are currently out of print, but you can find them on Amazon from time to time, and I'd encourage you to pick them up if you get a chance. Poetry is tough. Ask any poet. It's not all that popular these days, nor has it really been popular in quite a while, and getting poetry published can be a real challenge. Grandpa's poetry, which he started writing in 1968 and still writes today, has always been critically well received, but has never been a big seller. And yet, he keeps cranking it out. Clearly his motivation is not financial, but it's more about getting his stuff out there, and I really admire that. These books came out within a couple years of one another, and this was at the high point of Grandpa's career as an English prof at Althouse at UWO in London. They deal with two very different subjects. A True History of Lambton County is, as you might expect, about the history of Lambton County. So Lambton County is where Sarnia is, and just south of Sarnia is Grandpa's hometown of Point Edward. Point Edward plays a huge part in Grandpa's poetry, and this is sort of where the seeds of that began to germinate. We'll talk about this, but you'll certainly get the importance. A True History of Lambton County is a really great book. It's very moving poetry, and it is about as CanLit as you can get. So, if you like CanLit, pick up a copy of A True History of Lambton County. It's also the far less challenging of the two as far as how easy a read it is. God's Geography is tougher. In God's Geography, Don's dealing with the themes of loss and mortality, framed by some losses he suffered in the years right around 1980. Grandpa's a quiet guy, he always has been, and to date, him and I have never really talked about some of this stuff. Family stuff has never been something we really addressed. We just kind of enjoyed our lives in our little corner of North London, and we didn't really talk about it. Consequently, I know very little about his parents, and the, by all accounts, pretty hard lives both of them lived. In the last few years, Grandpa has started to talk about this kind of thing a little bit more. He wrote a book called Uncles and Anecdotes for the Family that does a pretty impressive job of biography on a bunch of the relatives on his side. There are some very strange stories in our family's past, and I hope we'll get to share a few with you. We're not here to air the laundry, but this is stuff I want to know. Grandpa's doing fine, but he's getting older, and he's got so many stories to tell. It's time I heard some of them. A quick technical note, and an apology up front. During the first few minutes of this recording, I was having some mic trouble, so you may catch a bit of echo, and you may also hear me breathing into the mic like a bison. All I can say is I'm sorry, and please stick with it. The annoying stuff is mostly out of the way in the first 10 minutes. Quick trigger warning as well. We talk about the death of parents in this episode. If that's a hard topic for you, feel free to skip over that part or check out another episode. So, without further ado, let's go to my conversation with Don.
Would you stop me say no, no, no. I guess I'll stay on by a little longer.
All right, everybody, welcome. I'm here again with Don Gutteridge. How are you, Grandpa?
I'm fine, thanks, Tom.
Great. Well, I'm really glad to be here. So, the two books we're going to be discussing today are A True History of Lambton County, which was, I believe, was released in, is it 1970? I think it's 1977. I think you're right. Yes, 1977. And then God's Geography, which I believe is 82. 82. Both books of poetry, but non-traditional poetry.
Right.
So I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you, what led up to you writing A True History of Lambton County?
Well, I had written about the village earlier in a little booklet called The Village Within, which was 1968 or 9.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started to get published by Oberon, who was more of a major national publisher than the little fiddlehead poetry books I published with originally,
right.
I thought, well, I went back and reread some of those poems, and I thought, well, I pulled 2 or 3 of them out and used them over again.
Mm-hmm.
and that got me thinking about the village again.
Yeah.
And so I started writing new village poems to sort of complement the older village poems, and I managed to use a couple as well. But I've always been interested in Point Edward ever since I wrote Bus Ride, my first novel set in Point Edward.
Mm-hmm.
That was my first real contact with the home village.
Yeah.
And it's a book I still love. I haven't reread it for years, but it was a comic novel, and which was new for me, and I like trying new things. But anyway, that I started thinking about the village probably in 1973, 74 when that was published.
Yeah.
And so and I knew I was through the epics. I was finished with them. I'd covered all the Indians I could find.
Yep.
And so, like any artist, you're searching around for your next project, hoping that the muse is still with you.
Yep.
And where I got the idea for using historical documents, I don't know.
Yeah.
I honestly don't know. All I know is I spent an awful lot of time in the Western Library in the microfilm section because there was no internet in 1977 and 82.
Exactly.
So I had to dig up all of those historical, what we used to call it found poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a number of Canadian poets using found poetry, so I was not really original in doing that.
I was going to talk to you after about this, but this is probably a good time to bring it up. So on the rear jacket of the book, the description of the book is actually very it's accurate, but Fred Cogswell appears again.
Oh yes,
our old friend Fred Cogswell from Coppermine. Remind me who Fred Cogswell was again, Grandpa?
He was a professor of Canadian literature, New Brunswick, University of New Brunswick.
Okay.
And he was a well-known poet and a translator from French Canadian poetry into Canadian English.
Yep.
And he ran the Fiddlehead Poetry Books.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he published something close to 500 chapbooks.
Wow.
And he typed them all himself. He was a really going concern in Canadian literature, and I got to know him very early on through the League of Canadian Poets. We used to have annual meetings,
right?
And we became very good friends, and he became my publisher.
Mm-hmm. It says on the back here, Fred Cogswell once said that Don Gutteridge is the only poet in Canada capable of creating myths. I like that. To me, there's sort of an interesting, I don't know if it's in one of these books, where you're talking about the idea of myth versus truth versus history, and it always seems like you've always had a fascination with myth.
Yes, I have, yeah.
And I think it sort of adds to the somewhat dreamlike quality that you ascribe to Point Edward. It often seems like mythical in a way.
Yeah, it was a very unusual village, and I took advantage.
Another thing that was fascinating to me was this section about the Baldoon Mysteries.
Oh, that's another book I found in the library called The Baldoon Mysteries, yeah. And it was about a haunted house.
Yeah.
Where the things are supposed to fly off the table and float through the air. And a number of people would go down to the area and see if they could see these things. Mm-hmm. And that's what's recounted in the book, is various people's encounters with these so-called mysteries.
A house, I think that the part that made me laugh was the talking about the house lighting on fire 50 to 60 times a day and having to be put out.
I forgot that.
Pots and pans flying around, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Where was this house supposedly?
I think it would be somewhere around Dresden.
Okay.
Somewhere between Chatham and Windsor, down in that area.
Okay, inland.
Yeah, there is still a Baldoon settlement somewhere down in that area.
Yeah,
It's just a hamlet now. That's not even a village.
Yeah, and they're, as in a lot of your work, it's pointing out that people were very quick to blame the natives, as always. And then they seem to have found the book. Your book recounts a swan they've decided is a witch.
Yeah.
And that must be the cause of it, and so they kill this swan, and apparently that makes everything better. I was blown away by that. I thought that was hilarious. There's one more aspect to this book I wanted to ask you about. Our friend Grace Lucky makes another appearance.
Oh, yes.
As she tends to. Now, for a little bit of background, you can listen to our Summer's Idle and Winter's Descent episode where we talk at length about this. But Grace Lucky, I guess, so she was someone you went to school with when you were living on the fourth line.
Yes, and it was a one-room country school, and she was 2 rows over.
Yep. Used to ride her horse, Polly, was it? Dottie? Used to ride a horse at any rate.
Used to ride a horse, yeah.
Have you ever seen or heard of Grace Lucky in the years since?
No, she would have married and changed her name, so I was unable to find her, no.
So I have found her.
You have?
I do. Yeah, her name is Grace McEwen, and she still lives in Sarnia.
For God's sake.
I haven't contacted her for the moment, but yeah, I found Grace Lucky.
Oh, I'd love her to see some of the poems I've written.
Well, I will give you her number.
Oh, thank you.
My pleasure. It was a bit of a journey to find her.
But what I wanted to tell you was I got my grandmother wrong.
Yeah? How?
My grandmother was, to us, growing up, we lived just in her house on the top floor.
Yes.
Her maiden name was Ethel Reeve, and she had many brothers and sisters, so I had a lot of great uncles and great aunts and cousins. In fact, dozens of them in the Sarnia area. And one day, when I was playing golf, my uncle Bob Potsy came to the golf course, and he said, "I've got a story to tell you." He said, "Your grandma isn't your grandma." I said, "What do you mean, grandma isn't my grandma?" And he said, "Her name is Ethel Cookman. She was born and raised in central London in England.
Yes.
Became good friends with Edith Reeve. They lived very close to one another. My grandmother's mother was a prostitute.
Okay.
So when the Reeve family, and there must have been 7 or 8 of them, emigrated to Canada, they brought my grandmother with them and passed her off as a Reeve. And she kept that secret all her life. I don't think even my grandfather knew.
How did it come to light?
It came to light because my second cousin, Jean, was in hospital, not doing too well with leukemia. And my uncle came to visit her. And they got talking, because they always got along, the two of them. They got jawing away. And my uncle said to her, "I've always wanted to ask you a question, Jeannie. Why is it that all the Reeves have big noses, but my grandma does not. She has a tiny little nose like mine.
Yeah.
And Jean said, well, that would be the case. And he said, what do you mean that was the case? She said, well, she wasn't a Reeve.
Wow.
And that's how he found out.
And
this was years and years after my grandparents died.
yeah.
This was 1979.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so that's actually pre-publication of A True History.
Yeah, of A True History, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That actually does explain there. You've written a few poems about your mom in later collections that we'll touch on, but you do mention that hardscrabble upbringing in London, and I was unaware of the rest of that, but that's fascinating.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story.
That is fascinating.
And it was a family that battled all the time,
Yeah.
and yet no one told. That was a secret they all kept.
Yeah.
Even though they sniped at one another and had feuds, and it was quite a family. So, as my uncle said, I just lost all my relatives.
Yeah.
But I still count them as my aunts and uncles.
Yeah.
And there's a poem about them in A True History of Lambton County.
So, if it's all right with you, we can move on to God's Geography.
Yeah, please.
Great. Okay, so this may be one of my favorite books of yours I've ever read.
Mm-hmm.
What gave you... So basically, the format of God's Geography is that each section is prefaced by a mixed media page that has headlines, newspaper articles,
Mm-hmm.
first-person interviews,
Right?
and then the poetry proper.
The poetry, yeah.
I guess the first question I wanted, and I know the answer, I'm sure you were researching at the UWO library. Now, the headlines and newspaper articles, are those actually from the paper?
They're from the Sarnia Observer.
Yeah.
And what I did, each of the sections begins with what you described.
Mm-hmm.
And I take my birthday, September 30th.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a way of sort of making it historical without having to do all the historical reading.
Oh, I missed that.
Yeah.
They're all
September 30th.
Ah,
And
I
that's
had
how
missed
I
that.
made that's how I made the selection.
I think it's sort of funny. So that the day of your birth, we have your birth announcement, a playwright in London getting scrutinized, and an ad for a Western, which is relevant. I mean, we certainly talked a little
You can
about
see
that.
what was going through my head as I was looking for material.
So what I meant, and then the last thing is there's a mention of infantile paralysis, which I had to Google. That's polio. Correct?
Polio, that's
Polio.
right, yeah.
Okay.
And I had rheumatic fever, so it wasn't quite polio, but that's probably why I picked that one out of there.
So these sort of intro pages, you went through the whole paper and picked out ones
the whole paper,
that would fit.
and whatever looked either comical or interesting or related to some aspect of the local history.
There is one quote in here that I'm fairly sure is maybe the funniest thing I've ever read. I'm going to try and find it here. I could not believe that this was... So this is, I believe it is a letter to the... Or it's somebody speaking to the paper about an epidemic of children stealing apples. This is... What? I could not believe this. Okay, I'm just going to read it and let it speak for itself. I wish to call the attention of thoughtful citizens to a plague spot in the moral health of our, in many ways, beautiful city. This vandalism is rampant just now, where fruit hangs temptingly in our gardens. In permitting our children and young people to get away with this small crime, as it may be called by some, we are allowing their sense of mine and thine to become demoralized. They are embryo burglars. Let not the war abroad blind us to the very beginnings of Hitlerism here at home. I could not believe that. Embryo burglars.
You can see what was going through my mind as I flipped through the paper and found the most fantastic kinds of things.
Well, especially because I believe one of your poems in this book touches on exactly this: is you guys taking apples from an orchard,
Yeah,
getting chased out.
yeah, McPherson's orchard. Yeah,
That is so funny. There's a couple of I think overall the next couple of things we will be talking about are heavy topics.
mm-hmm.
in a way that's accessible and emotionally honest, I think, and I really like that about it. The first thing is fires. It seems like everything was lighting on fire in this book.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Did you feel like there was a lot of fires in your town when you were young?
There was one. There were two, actually. The post office burned down. No, it was the same fire. The post office and Burgess Market were in the same building.
Yeah.
And that was only about 500 yards from our house.
Mm-hmm.
And it went up in smoke.
Mm-hmm.
One early evening.
Yeah.
One of the young men who worked there knocked over a can of gasoline and it caught fire.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother and I sat in our upstairs window and watched the thing burn to the ground.
Wow.
And that's one of those childhood iconic memories that just sticks with you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where that comes from, yeah.
And then, so what was the fire where a hot rivet from the bridge started a fire?
Oh, that's right, yeah. Yeah, Bob McCord's
Rink
burned down.
Said it burned down in 20 minutes. It's a very sturdy rink.
So all that was there when I grew up were the boards. I never did see that arena because it burned down before I was born.
Gotcha.
And the bridge comes in, of course. I saw it from my bedroom window every day of my life, and I've seen photographs of Point Edward without the bridge, but I've never seen it when it didn't have that bridge.
One question, I guess, before we get into some of the other stuff, which will take us down some sort of rabbit holes. You ended up in London because this is where you had work. Like, you worked at Althouse for years. Did you ever have the inclination that you wanted to go back to Point Edward to live?
No.
No?
No. You become basically. We became middle class bourgeois characters, and no, I used to go back quite often though because my uncle and aunt lived there.
Yeah.
So and when I went back, I would go around and say hello to my friends again. So I did keep in touch with them for a little while.
Yeah.
And once my uncle and aunt moved away a few years ago, I lost complete contact. And I just went back last year for a nostalgic trip with a friend of mine.
Mm-hmm.
We spent the whole day walking around, and I kept pointing out, this is where Lily's house was, and here's the lane where Cap Dowling walked down the day he died. And so we had a fascinating day.
That's great.
Nostalgic day.
That's so great. If there's any editorial justice, Uncle Potsy's a fellow we'll have a chance to talk about at length. But Uncle Potsy would be the most senior member of your family that I ever met.
Yes.
I did not meet either of your parents. I met Uncle Potsy and Aunt Betty when I was young.
Right. I remember you were on one of his new boats, or the boat he built.
Yes.
And he was letting you hold the steering wheel for a while. You must have been maybe 7, maybe.
There's photo evidence of this. It exists in my mind as a child's memory, so I do remember it. I don't remember it clearly, but I believe there's photo evidence of this. We'll have to dig that out. I loved him. This is a topic that is kind of tough, but the theme of death is a huge part of this book. Yeah. I don't know if you perceive it that way, but it is to me. It was probably one of the defining traits of this book. Mm-hmm. Is reminiscence on mortality and losing those that are close to us. I guess a little bit of context before we get too much further into it. This book was published in 1982. My great-grandmother passed away in 1972. My great-grandfather in 1974.
Right.
Did it take time for you to process that into this art, or was it a conscious decision?
Not in my mother's case.
Mm-hmm.
The poem about my mother in the book is from a little chapbook that I published the year after she died. Mm-hmm. And I just reproduced it in here.
Gotcha.
The poem about my father was new.
Mm-hmm.
Was new for this book.
Well, it's gripping.
I also always wanted to write a poem about my maternal grandfather who was murdered. So.
Mm-hmm. Wait, what? I must have missed that. Your maternal... Oh, that's the fella that's standing with the cannon.
Emigre, yeah.
I didn't know he was murdered.
My grandfather was actually third generation. My maternal grandfather was a third generation McWaters.
Okay.
But I invented, for the sake of the poem, which I wanted to make him an emigre, I invented an Irish past for him. So the first section is fictional. The rest of it is actually true.
Yes.
He had an amazing life.
Now, you don't remember meeting him?
No,
or
he lived
him?
with us. When he died in 1938, and I was slightly less than a year old. He died in May or June of 1938. Okay. So I don't remember him, but my mother says that he lived with us. And he was semi-retired at that time. My mother said she went to the inquest, which is described in the poem, and the coroner said that in all the years he'd been doing inquests, he never heard so many lies in his entire life.
Yeah, and so
they all just lied.
And so they basically sold it as he had fallen down, he had suffocated.
Yeah.
What do you think happened?
Well, he had a mark on the back of his head the size of a silver dollar. It said in the story in the Sarnia Observer.
Yeah.
So he was struck on the back of the head by something sharp or solid,
and expired.
Probably a hammer or something about that size, and he fell down, and he had such a high alcoholic content in his blood he couldn't breathe, and he smothered to death.
Okay.
So it was murder. There's no question he was, and that's why they had the inquest, because the police suspected that somebody had done it, and the purpose of the inquest was to see if they could get some of the truth. Yeah. But,
and everyone either lied or stayed silent.
Everybody either lied or stayed silent. No. And of course they weren't drinking ginger ale. It was a bootleggers.
Yeah, it was a booze can. Exactly. Yeah, it was certainly not.
And of course there was laughter in the courtroom.
Yeah, when they're describing overdoing it on ginger ale.
There's a certain bizarre quality to sections of that poem.
Yeah.
But I can never resist humor. I mean, I put those pieces in because I thought this is a very sad story, of course, and very sad to me.
Well, of course.
But there you are. This was written up in the local newspaper. I followed the trial right through the paper as it went along. It was not front page, but third page on the local third page every day, because he was a well-known person in the community.
Yeah. Have you ever heard of the podcast called Serial, Grandpa? Probably not, but
no.
It's done by NPR, where they go digging into these old cases. That sounds like the kind of case Serial would investigate. It's probably a little too old for their tastes, but.
And again, that's one of the last of my what I call natural lines, longer lines with natural breaks to them and so on.
Yeah.
Long before I got on the old 3-beat line.
Yeah, the old 3-beat drop lines. Well, that's sort of still how I write. So when I get around to it, this is there's just sort of a little side note. When you're describing, well, I guess it's not a side note. It's something to think about. When you're describing, I guess the death of your mother, my great grandmother, was it sudden?
Yes.
Huh. And she would have been. How old was she?
In her 53rd year.
Yeah. Not terribly old. Now you're describing the room where she passed. Is this okay, Grandpa?
Yeah.
Okay.
No problem.
Okay, good.
No, it was a tragic death. My mother had a bad neck, and I took her to the hospital, and it was 30 below zero, and they made her sit in the hospital in a gown for about 2 hours before they looked at her.
Oh, boy.
And then I took her out and I drove her home.
Yeah.
In this cold, and I think she caught pneumonia.
Mm-hmm.
But we didn't know she was ill, and it was over New Year's, so her doctor was away. So she lived on her own, and I just went over there on New Year's Day, and she was dead.
And you found her?
I found her. We didn't even know she was ill.
Oh my God!
I mean, she said she didn't feel very well, but your mother and I were both, or your grandma and I were both there the night before she died, and she was sleeping, lying on the couch and talking to us and saying she thought she was getting better.
Man.
And the next morning she was dead.
Oh my God, that's horrible. I never knew that you were the one that found her.
Yeah, I found her.
That's very brutal. In the section you're describing the death of your mother, my great grandmother, you also mention it's sort of as a counterpoint. You mention a hometown murder in Point Edward.
Oh yeah, that of course in a small village was big news. Yeah, I think it was. I've lost track of the name of that family now. But they lived in shacks over. The family lived in a couple of shacks over by the slip, and were notorious around town. And the young man, I don't know whether they were married, but they were living together. He murdered his wife, and it was manslaughter. And sort of that all happened before I was born. But I heard the stories.
Okay.
All my life in Point Edward. That was the only murder that anybody ever knew of that ever happened.
Well, and then there's a fire related to it as well.
Yes.
Right? The day he leaves town, his house burns down.
His house burns down, yeah.
So that was one of the other fires I was thinking of.
Yeah.
And then you intersperse this story of the only murder in Point Edward's history with your mom's her last days. What did she do in Toronto? What was her trade after the factory years?
She worked for the provincial government. And in the she had a number of cases of people who were on welfare receiving mother's allowance.
Yeah.
And she was called a decision maker. And she would decide whether this mother fit the particular criteria. So she had a very important job.
Yeah.
And but her health just went. She never got over my father leaving her.
Yeah.
So I always said she died of a broken heart because she was inconsolable. And she was working on her own in Toronto, and she did that for about 5 years.
Yeah.
And we used to drive down and visit her. She had a lovely apartment there and so on. And I thought she would just stay there, but finally her health gave out. So we brought her back here and put her up in a small apartment and looked after her.
Yeah.
But she was very young. Of course, my dad was only 58. So
yeah. Well, I mean, not to skip ahead, but one of the parts in the poem about your father's death is that you never forgave him for coming back the second time. That would be coming back as an old, broken man. Because when did he leave great grandma permanently?
About 1957, I was in second year university. He told my mother that he was being transferred on the railway to London.
Yeah.
And so they came down here. They got an apartment on Tecumseh Ave.
Yeah.
And he went back to Chatham, and he was supposed to come back.
Yeah.
And he never came back.
Wow.
And then he quit his job.
Really?
And the next thing we knew, a couple of years later, he goes out west and lives in Calgary for 10 years. And that's what I mean by coming back. Because by then he was a complete alcoholic. And I'll never forget the day I first saw him when he came back. I looked in his face and I couldn't believe what I saw. He was a broken man.
Yeah, he's an unbelievably tragic figure, and I don't know. It seems like the treatment he receives in your books is, I would say, generous, considering what an unbelievable bastard he seemed to be at times.
Yeah. Well, he learned to drink during the war, and when I grew up when we lived in Chatham and I was in high school, he was a model father actually for about 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
And then he started drinking again.
Yeah.
And then he switched from beer to straight whiskey. And in the end, he was drinking 2 bottles of whiskey a day.
God. And you describe seeing him in a dingy room, yellow, cirrhotic.
Oh yeah, that room he had in Sarnia, as I was describing. He lived with another guy who was also an alcoholic, and they lived together.
Yeah.
And I think my uncle Potsy took me to see him, and he was even in worse shape than I had seen him years before.
Yeah, and the pathos in that poem of him with the yellowed newspaper clippings of his better days.
His better days, yeah. He had a scrapbook with all his newspaper clippings in it.
Because the earlier parts of the book have all these newspaper clippings of him playing hockey.
Oh, yeah.
He was an incredible hockey player.
He was an incredible hockey player, yeah. He was invited by Jack Adams, the manager of the Detroit Red Wings, to come down and try out for the team in September of 1939.
Yeah.
And the next day he joined the Air Force. And so he never went to the tryout camp. And when he was stationed in Ottawa, he played semi-professional baseball. He was
really.
I never got any of his athletic ability.
Yeah,
neither did my brother. But
and it didn't come down the line to me either. That is amazing.
Yeah, I see him as a tragic figure with so much talent and so much waste. Some people apparently are susceptible to it.
Yes.
Their metabolism is such that they're more susceptible to it than others, and I think it was probably his case, because he didn't want to. He had really good instincts, and I say for 4 or 5 years he was a model father, so I actually got to like him very much. Though I never met him until I was 7.5 when he came home from the war.
Well, I mean, as far as the alcoholism thing goes, it tends to be genetic. It tends to come down the line.
Yeah, that's right.
You missed it. Your grandson's got it.
Yeah.
Like I am an alcoholic, absolutely. So reading that is like a cautionary tale for me. That, I'm lucky that I recognize that I have that problem, and so I'm taking measures to try and fix it. But consequently, my emotional reaction to this book is intense.
Been very powerful, eh?
Very, it almost bordered on the physically painful, especially for something like the treatment of your mom in these books makes me quite like her, makes me wish I had met her. The treatment of your dad makes me... It's hard to say that I really don't like someone I never met, but it just, the horror of his life towards the end is very, very upsetting.
He was also a taxidermist.
Really?
Yeah.
I never knew that.
That's how he made his living in Calgary.
Is that why you had that taxidermied squirrel for all those years?
Yeah, your grandma hated it so much we finally got rid of it. But I hung on to it for sentimental reasons. It was the only thing of my dad's that I actually had. And he used to mount bighorn sheep for Americans who would come up and shoot them, and then he would mount them. And he apparently, I never actually found out whether this was completely true, but he told me that he had several of his mounted ones in the Glencoe Museum in Calgary.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
He was a master taxidermist.
That's fat. Like I wouldn't.
Yeah.
I had never heard that before today.
Yeah.
I do remember that taxidermied squirrel from when I was young.
I definitely do. Yeah.
It used to sit in the upstairs hall closet.
And we had a raccoon, which we got rid of as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do remember Grandma hating it because I asked about it, and she wouldn't even discuss it with me.
She didn't like the concept of taxidermy. It wasn't just the squirrel. She didn't think you should be mounting these things and looking at them.
It is a little strange. A squirrel, I almost don't understand. A bighorn sheep, I can sort of understand.
Yeah.
As long as you eat it, I think I'm okay.
Well, he was just practicing on little raccoons and squirrels when he first started. But he taught himself out of an online, or not an online, but
out of a book?
A pamphlet, set of pamphlets.
He would have been well ahead of his time if he'd been getting his stuff online.
He was very talented, and his nickname in all of those stories is Crooner Gutteridge because he could sing.
That was another point I wanted to bring up was... they keep calling him Crooner Gutteridge.
Yeah, that was his nickname. Yeah.
There's a great section, and I wonder I think this might be in reference to Tom Gutteridge, the original Tom Gutteridge.
Yeah, right.
Who, it's a bit about, it's in the paper of him and a friend from the hockey team riding their bikes singing.
Oh, yeah.
At night, and then the girlfriends of them going after the reporter for reporting on that.
Yeah, my Uncle Tom was an athlete too. Not as good as my dad, but he played softball and hockey. Yeah.
Yep. And
I played golf with him. I wrote a poem about him.
Yes. Yeah, you describe golfing with him.
Yeah.
It really is. Reading this for me, I guess, just to give you a little bit of how I was feeling. True History of Lambton County was nice. Like, it's sort of a nice. It's an easier read. It's not. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit like how Summer's Idol relates to Winter's Descent, but I find God's Geography to be the more powerful of the two works, just because I have an emotional connection to it, probably. But reading God's Geography was hard for me. Like, I was made sad by a lot of it.
Right.
One quick point, that as we neared towards the end of God's Geography, you're sort of, there's a section where you deal with the death of your parents. There's a section where you're dealing with the idea of leaving. And then there's a part where you're describing, and this is almost like a passage from Summer's Idol, where you're describing trying to find the point of Point Edward.
Oh, yeah.
There isn't one.
There isn't a point. No. There probably used to be initially, maybe two centuries ago.
Yeah.
But at one time in the 17th century, there were 3 entrances to the lake.
Yeah.
It was like a little delta there.
Mm-hmm.
And but no, we never did find the point.
I always thought that was rich with semiotic potential. Absolutely. There's another bit, and this is sort of unrelated, but it does relate to your dad. The 1917 coming home sober after being.
Well, I'll tell you, that's a wonderful story.
Okay, what happened?
What it was based on was what happened to my cousin Ronnie.
Yeah.
My Uncle George's eldest son.
Yeah.
My Uncle George didn't care much for borders. He worked in Detroit, married in Detroit, moved to Sarnia, became vice president of the bus company. Mm-hmm. And his son Ronnie, one day in 1952, went across the bridge to the 402 Club because it was the only club that stayed open after midnight in the area. Mm-hmm. And so he went over there drinking.
Yeah.
And on his way back, they said, "You've just enlisted." He said, "What do you mean I've just enlisted?" They said, "You're an American citizen. You're going to Korea."
Oh, my God.
So he spent 2 years in Korea.
Oh, my God.
And that's a version of the story that I invented for 1917.
Yeah,
that actually happened. Ronnie was away for 2 years.
He got sent to Korea.
Changed his life forever, of course. I don't think he didn't marry. He never really got over.
Oh my God! But he wasn't an American citizen.
He was born in Detroit.
And
my dad, my uncle didn't tell him. He never knew he was born. He never knew where he was born. No, it was a crazy family.
Oh,
I mean,
no.
I had an aunt for years, an uncle living in Port Huron, and they were originally from Sarnia.
Yeah.
And people crossed the border back and forth. Some of them stayed in Sarnia and worked in the States.
Yeah.
And Uncle George just lost track.
Oh my God! And he didn't know he was an American citizen.
He didn't. He had no idea.
Oh my God!
But
he got sent to Korea.
They had his name on a list at the border.
Yeah, he was probably on the draft list.
He was on the draft list.
Oh no! Oh my God!
Yeah.
Oh my God!
No, I mean, you can see why I write such crazy stories.
Yeah, I can. Oh my God! Okay, well, the last thing I wanted to touch on before we sort of sum up, the very last poem in God's Geography is about Isabel MacDonald.
Oh yeah, my favorite poem.
Yeah, that's a beautiful poem. Now, remind me who Isabel MacDonald is.
She was my grade 3 teacher.
Yeah.
And I wrote my first story in grade 3. Mm-hmm. And I finished it off with something to do with, and they went pell-mell home. They all went pell-mell home.
Mm-hmm.
And that was stolen from the grade 3 reader.
Yeah.
And that's what the poem is about. She knew
Mm-hmm.
when she said it was a very good story, Donald.
Mm-hmm. Original plot, Donald, and a fine ending.
Yeah.
Because that would be the genesis of you as a writer.
Exactly, it is, yeah.
Now, did you keep in touch with her in later years?
Oh, no, only after I'll tell you that story, too, because it's
please.
amazing.
Yeah, please.
I went, in 1979, I went to Lambton County
Mm-hmm.
with a film and a tape recorder to get kids to write poetry in elementary school.
Yeah.
I spent a whole week going from school to school, one in the morning, one in the afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
And on the Thursday afternoon, I went to the school. The principal said, go right on up. The teacher will be there in a minute. The room is empty. So I went on up, and the room was empty, and I set down my tape recorder. And I looked up, and there was a woman sitting in the middle row at the back, in the back seat.
Yeah.
And I said, this isn't a teacher or a student. And I looked down, and I said, hello, Miss McDonald. And she said, hello, Donald.
Oh, my God.
She had found my itinerary
Yeah.
in the local paper,
Yeah.
knew I was going to be there,
Mm-hmm.
and sat there and watched the children write poetry. And then we had a great conversation.
That's amazing.
And after that, we corresponded. We wrote letters back and forth.
That's amazing.
And so she must have, oh golly, she must have been in her 70s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because if it was 79 and she would have been your teacher in the late 40s.
Late 40s, yeah.
Wow. 30 some years later.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
That's an amazing story, isn't it?
That is an amazing
I looked
story.
down there and I recognized her instantly.
Wow. Well, I guess finally, as we always do, I'll ask you, how does it make you feel to read these books all these years later?
Steeped in nostalgia, really.
Yeah.
It's memories that you haven't thought of for a while, but suddenly all come back to you after you kind of read the poems.
Mm-hmm.
And no, I probably shouldn't say this, but I actually enjoyed reading them.
Yeah. I think you're allowed to say that.
Yeah.
Well, I really enjoyed reading them too. I think God's Geography is one that they're both great. I think God's Geography is one that I'll reread frequently because it
got some very good reviews. It
was
one of my best reviewed books.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as always, it's been really great to talk to you, Grandpa. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Would you stop me saying no, no, no? I guess I'll stay on by a little longer.
Apparently, he found his mom dead. I wasn't ready for that one. I kept it together okay in the moment, but I'm not exactly cool right now. I think I'll probably be a while processing that one. I learned a lot in that conversation, and some of it's kind of hard to take in. Like, what a sad end. What a burden to carry. For a quiet guy like Grandpa, clearly the way to process that kind of grief is to write, and maybe I could learn something from that. I'm going to post some of these poems on our website, gutteridgeshows.ca, so you can read them at your leisure. I would recommend it. I also wasn't exactly planning on admitting my problem with alcohol to Grandpa in this format, but I sort of feel like he had to know about the genetic side of it. I may never be able to forgive his father for being such an Olympic-level dick, but maybe knowing at least some of it wasn't his fault might help us both a bit. That taxidermy thing sure came out of left field. Grandpa definitely knew how to pull me out of the sadness slide I was heading into there. I definitely needed it. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. I know it wasn't exactly light listening, but it mattered. check out our website, gutteridgeshows.ca, for all the podcasts from our family. Find us on iTunes, and if you could rate, review, and subscribe, that's always a big help in getting our stuff out there. Thanks to Joe Organ and Moves for the use of their song A Little Longer from the album Tape for our intro and outro music. Find Moves on Bandcamp and Joe Organ on SoundCloud. Google's going to ask if you're looking for Joe Rogan. You're not. I'm Tom Gutteridge. This has been There and Then. A good sign-off is hard to find. Take some time, expand your mind.
I guess I'll stay on by.